All right, hey guys, it's good to be with you via screen. My name is Aaron Christenberry, and I'm going to be introducing these two to you, but I want you guys to share your name, what your role is, and what your favorite quarantine snack is. All right, your favorite quarantine snack. So I'll go ahead and I'll give you a second to think about it. My name is Aaron Christenberry. I'm the high school pastor here at WCC, and so far my favorite quarantine snack has been oatmeal cream pies.
Very nice.
Cream pies.
Yeah.
I'm Sydney Schaefer. I was an intern here at WCC, and I go to Indiana Wesleyan University. My favorite quarantine snack is I eat a lot of pretzels with Nutella. I really like that.
So you get the sweet and the salty kind of thing going.
Yeah, mostly it's just because I like Nutella, and I need a vehicle for it.
That's right.
So.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm Ryan Langland. I'm middle school pastor here, and normally I like chips and salsa, but if we haven't had the opportunity to go out and get any salsa, just chips will do. That's what I'm realizing, just chips that have been laying around. The cheddar and sour cream chips that we have, my kids call shabby chips, and I don't know why, but I have a new appreciation for just chips in general. Shabby chips are great. It's like, oh wow, I forgot how good these things were. So yeah, I just like chips. If they're just old chips, new chips, whatever, if they're around, I'll eat those in a quarantine situation, absolutely.
That's good. Awesome. Well, those are good snacks. You guys have good taste, by the way. I'll throw that out there. But hey, we've got a few announcements for you. So we'll actually have Ryan kick it off from the middle school.
Sure. Yeah. So middle schoolers, hey, tonight's a little bit different. Obviously, happy Easter. We've got a special Easter message from all of us to you guys. But starting next week, we're going to be addressing some, I think, popular, interesting questions that we have as Christians. For instance, next week we talk about, is Jesus going to be coming again? And we're going to get some different perspectives, some from yes, some from no, some from, well, maybe an entirely different sort of approach to that. So I'm excited about presenting these interesting questions over the next few weeks. And if you have any, you can feel free to share that with me. Instagram, email that, whatever. There's lots of ways to get a hold of me. I'm excited to hear from you guys on what we should be tackling in the next few weeks.
Awesome. And then from the high school side of things, we're going to keep things going in our One Another series where we talk about what does it look like to live and love one another in the times where the only people that are surrounding us are our family, and sometimes family can get on our nerves. So how do we love one another? How do we encourage one another? And so we're going to be continuing on with that over the next couple of weeks. And also another note for high school student ministry, we are continuing on in our Instagram mini-series. Those take place during the week, our Instagram mini-series. So if you would like to share a devotional for one of those days, go ahead and contact us through Instagram or Facebook or text us, and we would love to get you on that series. So that's a little bit about what's going on in the student ministry world here at WCC. But today is Easter and Resurrection Sunday, and we get to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that is the, as Denny said this morning in his message, that's the cornerstone that's the reason why we have our faith. Because if Jesus didn't raise from the grave, then all of this, everything we've done, all the worship music, it would all be for naught. It would all be in vain. That's what Paul writes in one of his letters to the churches. So tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about being resurrection people, and we're going to be telling some of our favorite stories, some of our favorite from the ashes stories. Okay, so we're going to be sharing some stories. I'm going to be asking the questions, and then I'm going to be turning it over to Sydney and Ryan. So for this first one, Sydney, we'll start with you on this one. What is your favorite from the ashes stories from the Bible? So what's a story where you see resurrection or from the ashes?
Yeah, when I was first thinking about this, I was thinking more like a person, but then I really wanted to share with you the story of like Israel and how they came out of the ashes after they had been in exile for a really long time. They had their hometown was destroyed when people came and attacked it, and then they had to go live in Babylon. And then after all that happened, they came back to Jerusalem, and they start rebuilding things. And now they're just really scared about the people around them because that was who attacked them. And so if you want to read about this, you can read about it in like Jeremiah the prophet or in Daniel. And then Ezra is when they come back. And in Ezra 3:3 it says, despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built an altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and the evening sacrifices. And they also went on to build a temple. That was the first things that they did when they came back. Rising out of the ashes, they came worshiping God.
Thanks for sharing that, Sydney. Ryan, what about you?
Yeah, Grace, I love that. I love that there's so many Old Testament stories and books that were written from that perspective of this scattered, leaderless people, Israel out in Babylon, and then coming back and deciding, okay, what are we going to be all about as a people? And the entire time, what they maintained was just the law, just following the Lord and what he had desired for his people. And that's really cool. And as I mentioned for our middle schoolers the past couple of weeks, like we're owning these stories, right? These Old Testament stories are part of our history now because we are a resurrection people. We're people that follow Jesus Christ. We're people that have that Messiah. This is all of a sudden a part of our story as well. So yeah, thank you, Sydney, for sharing that. I just thought of Lamentations when I was thinking of your story that you were bringing up, and this is sort of like how they felt in that exile situation. Lamentations 1. The first few verses here. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who was once great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her friends, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. How sad that is. Like how crazy that is to be separated from everything that you once held secure. But God's people rose once again. They came back to their homeland, they maintained their faith, and they grew. And now we are sort of part of that heritage right now. And that's an amazing sort of story. I love that. Sydney, that's fantastic. I would just echo that as sort of like the most powerful example I can get from Scripture of people rising from the ashes. Really cool stuff. Aaron, what do you got?
I really enjoyed hearing your guys' stories of groups of people that have come from the ashes. The story that I chose was from the story in the book of Acts. Where Philip and the Ethiopian have an encounter. So it's more of an individual story. But it's in Acts chapter 8, verses 26, and I won't read the whole thing, it's a little lengthy, but this is kind of the first part of it. It says, now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, go south to the road, the desert road, that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, he was an important official in charge of all the treasury of the Kandake, which means the queen of Ethiopians. And the man had gone to Jerusalem to worship. And on his way home, he was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, go to the chariot and stay near it. Then Philip ran to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet, and he asked him the question, do you understand what you're reading? So Philip asked the man, do you know what you're reading? And then the Ethiopian responds, how can I, unless someone explains it to me? And so he invited Philip to come and sit with him, and they had this conversation, and they talked about it, and the Ethiopian asked Philip, like, what is this story about in Isaiah? And as they traveled, and this is what it says, the eunuch said, tell me, please, who is the prophet that Isaiah is talking about? And then he goes on to tell him, it's the good news of Jesus. That's who this story in Isaiah is about. And then he goes on to say, and it says, the Spirit of the Lord revealed himself to the Ethiopian, and it was just a neat story of transformation of the resurrection of Jesus impacting an individual person.
Very cool.
So anyway, that's those are some neat stories on the from the ashes stories from the Bible. But now we want to turn to, when we think about history, when we think about the history of the world, what are some from the ashes stories, or what is one story that stands out to you? Ryan, let's go with you, and then we'll go to Sydney.
Yeah, there's a lot of potential stories to share. I think that just to show Christians' resolve and just their durability and their desire to grow even from the most dire, awful situations.
Mm-hmm.
One of them that kind of sticks out to me is from Thomas. So you remember Thomas, right? Reading through the Bible, he's doubting Thomas, right? He's the person that did not believe from the rest of the disciples that Jesus had rose again and said, you know what? If I'm not touching his wounds, if I'm not putting my hand in his side that was pierced, I'm not going to believe this stuff. The rest of the story, by tradition and by some written accounts, is that Thomas actually took the gospel after Pentecost and went just straight east. He went along something called the Silk Road, which is something that was just newly developed at that time. And he just went straight through, actually, what was Babylon back in the day. It was Iran, as we know it right now. Went straight into India with this and established churches along the way. So we know where he went because there's churches popping up along the Silk Road going east to where eventually he was martyred for his faith. And when you think about it, those letters that we read right now in the New Testament that circulated around Israel, those did not really make it out east. So really all these Eastern churches had that sort of tied them together was Thomas. And after he died, you'd think that these churches are absolutely just going to get destroyed. Okay, they're in this place where in a lot of cases they were experiencing persecution because of this new faith that people had. It just didn't have the leadership after Thomas died. And you'd think that, man, that's just a recipe for failure. But actually these churches thrived, even in the absence of Thomas. So after he was killed for his faith, and as that sort of visible example was set forth for the rest of the church, they just continued to grow. And that's amazing testament to just sort of the Christians' durability and ability to sort of rise from the ashes and to show Jesus Christ in that kind of way. So one of these ancient Indian writings here from someone who set out to kill Thomas actually says this: "I stirred up death, the apostles to slay, that by their death I might escape Christ's blows. But harder still am I now stricken. The apostle I slew in India has overtaken me in Edessa, and the Lord haunts me." So it's sort of this person's testimony who was at once hostile to Thomas and this new faith, now all of a sudden sees Jesus and sees the work of Jesus Christ in his life and the life of the church, and he becomes part of this church. So this is amazing how all of a sudden these churches thrive even amidst the most difficult circumstances that they find themselves. And I think that's amazing. It all starts with Thomas and this gospel message.
Yeah, Sydney, what about you? What's a story from history that you look to from inspiration from the ashes?
I think one of my favorite stories is about the early church father Augustine. If you're fancy, you say Augustine, but whatever. And so he's one of my favorite saints, and a lot of our theology comes from him. But he was raised in a Christian household, like a lot of us. And then as he started growing up, he wanted to go to college, and he wanted to go study in Carthage because he wanted to become a Roman official, like for the Roman Empire. And he wasn't very close to God. He wasn't rooted in what his family had given him. And when he was in college, he converted to Manichaeism, and which is another religion that kind of says that evil happens like outside of the body, which means that whatever you do can't really be evil. And so Augustine got into kind of like a lot of bad stuff when he was there at school. And then he went on to teach, it's called rhetoric, which is kind of like speaking, reasoning, and stuff. And while he was teaching this, he heard about this guy who was like speaking sermons. He wasn't super interested in Christianity, but he wanted to learn how this guy spoke. And so he went to hear him speak, and he was like, oh, like there might be something to this Christianity. And it was almost slowly and reluctantly that Augustine converted to Christianity. He had to kind of reason his way through it, and he wrote a book called Confessions, which is like an autobiography, but he's writing it to God. And it's all about his struggle with sin, with false idols, like his other religion. And what he says in that book is, to God, our hearts are restless until we rest in you. So he came from a very dark place, even in another religion, and then became one of the founders of like Christian theology.
That's neat. One of the stories that I've kind of been drawn to from the time I was a little kid was my mom told me this story about this pastor in New York City back, I believe it was in the 60s, but his name was David Wilkerson. And David Wilkerson he was like a little country preacher, and like he was a country preacher of a small country church. And one day he was praying, and he felt like the Lord was laying it on his heart to go to New York City and to evangelize to some of the gang members, some of the big gangs that were living in New York City. And so David Wilkerson basically sold some of his possessions so he could go live in New York City for a while and minister to the gang, the Muas. And the interesting thing was, so David was going and doing that, but the backstory to the Muas was their infamous gang leader, Nicky Cruz. At the age of 15, he moved from Puerto Rico to New York City to live with his brother. And see, Nicky Cruz didn't just move from Puerto Rico. He moved from one of the most, it's actually an infamous, dangerous city in Puerto Rico. It's one of the most dangerous cities there. So he moved from there to New York City, and by the age of, I believe it was 17, so in 2 years of being in America, he became the lord of this gang. And so at the age of 17, he was running drugs and like prostitution and gangs, and like he was responsible for all of this stuff. And this is the group that David Wilkerson went to share Jesus with, the hope that we have in Jesus. And so over the course of David interacting with this group, Nicky Cruz, God begins to soften his heart. This guy who was selling drugs on a large level, who was involved in gang murders, involved in gang fights, and just so many immoral things, God began to soften his heart to the point where one day David was speaking to a bunch of people, and Nicky gave his life to Jesus. And the story doesn't just end there. The cool thing is, Nicky goes on from that point, opens up his own ministry, and travels all around the country and all around the world sharing the hope of Jesus Christ. And through that testimony, through that ministry, and because of Jesus, many people have gotten saved because of the faithfulness of David Wilkerson and because of the resurrection power of Jesus. And so that's one of the stories that I've always been drawn to it since I was a little kid. So, but yeah, so we've shared a little bit of stories from the Bible and from history, and now we kind of want to turn to some personal stories. All right, so let's go ahead and share some from the ashes stories from right here in our own student ministries. So when you think about student ministries at WCC, what is something or a memory you have that sticks out?
Okay, well, I can start, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would say the honorable mention story from our student ministries and all the student ministries that I've been a part of. And I want to go specifically, actually, to someone that isn't from our church here, but I had in student ministry that I had several years back. So honorable mention story that applies, I think, to our student ministries here and lots of other groups that I've led are I think, small groups, continuing to meet together, sometimes despite difficult circumstances. So even actually right now, when you guys get together later on tonight, 6:45 p.m. or whenever you guys are meeting, and you're meeting online, that takes a lot of effort, a lot of intentionality to do that I think for a lot of people, they'd think, that group's just done. Or we could have just said in general, our teaching time and our small group time during this period of social distancing and isolation, that's just done. I see small groups continuing to gather despite difficult circumstances like changing of leadership, or sometimes people just not getting along with each other. Sometimes you just add different schools and an inability to sort of like connect, or just a lot of variables happening in small groups that you'd think, oh man, this mix is just not going to happen. But I see it happening anyway. I think students value getting together to contribute to other people and to be contributed to. And I think that's definitely a sort of rise from the ashes, rise from difficult circumstance situation that I see regularly here and in other ministries that I've led. Back in the day, my first sort of out-of-college youth ministry gig, I was at a boys' ranch in Wisconsin, and we had a guy named Phil Diggins who voluntarily went to our ranch. Most of the guys were sent there out of the juvenile justice system in Wisconsin, but Phil came on his own when he was 18 because he wanted to make something for himself, recognized that Milwaukee, where he came from, was just a horrible place to continue to grow up, had no opportunity out there. And so after getting a gunshot in his leg from 6 months earlier and realizing he just had no education opportunities out there, really no family and friends that were guiding him in the right direction, He decided to voluntarily come out to the ranch, earn his GED, become a teacher later on, and he's still teaching. He's doing an amazing job from just an upbringing that you just kind of write him off and be like, oh, this guy's going to be either dead or in prison for the rest of his life. I just love that he made something of himself as a result of the Lord's work in him, and just a die-hard, I will not be beaten kind of attitude that I've seen from him. So I love that. Use that as an example often in student ministry stories still.
Go ahead, Sydney.
Yeah, something that I experienced this summer when we went to Fairlane Mobile Home Park and we did a VBS there with our 7th graders and 8th graders, I think.
It was, yeah, there
Middle
were some
school
of them,
mission.
yeah.
We went to Fairlane and we were there for 3 days and it was hot and we were tired and we had ham sandwiches every day. We had a good time, but it was also really hard. There were a lot of people running around. It was kind of chaotic. But the last day that we were there was this little girl. Her and her sisters had come out every day. And we spent some time like sharing our testimonies with everyone. And I was talking to this little girl, and I was telling her about how God has made her. And I asked her if she wanted to invite Jesus into her heart, and she said yes. And so I prayed with her, and she was 5 years old. She was the cutest little girl. And she then later she goes, "I have God in my heart," which was like the cutest thing. But that happened really because of Christ working through us and our team, through student ministries at this Fairlane Mobile Home Park, where we had put in a lot of work ahead of time in a community garden in the days that we had been there previously, just being faithful to the Lord. And then it was just awesome to see the fruit of our faithfulness.
That's neat. That's neat. I'll share a quick honorable mention story. One story that kind of sticks out to me is when I was in college. I've been helping out with student ministries for about close to 10 years now. But while I was in college, I was helping out with a youth group where there was this student who was going through, his parents were going through divorce at the time, and some of his brothers weren't taking things well at all. But at that time, I was going through it was an assignment for one of my classes where I had to walk along, like basically they called it disciple, but it's walk through life with somebody else. And so I walked through life with this kid whose parents were going through a divorce, and it was neat to see. Basically, I'm going to fast forward and tell you a little bit about where he's at now. At the time, he was going through difficult times, and he was really asking a lot of questions about faith. But now he's actually getting ready to pursue ministry, and understanding like, hey, I want to help other people and I want to serve other people. And it's just neat to see the transformation that's kind of happened in his life and how he's grown up and said, hey, I want to serve other people and I want to serve God with my life. And so that was neat to see. But when I think about student ministry here at WCC, I've been here since August, so not even a whole school year. But some of the things that I've really enjoyed seeing is I've really enjoyed seeing a lot of you guys step up and serve in many different ways. I think one of my first memories coming in at the end of the summer last year was just being overwhelmed by walking around Sunlight and seeing how many of you students were serving on a pretty consistent basis. And that's a really neat thing to see. And I just love seeing when you make the shift from serving yourself to serving others. I think that's a moment where you see God working, and that's a from the ashes. That's a transformation because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so I just really enjoy seeing that kind of thing. So those are some of our favorite from the ashes stories. But we want to finish tonight with one last thought and one last question. And so I'm going to make the question simple. Why are we resurrection people? All right, so why are we resurrection people, and kind of what are your final words on this Easter Sunday to our students? So let's start with you, Sydney, and then we'll go to Ryan.
Thanks. All right. Paul talks about in 2 Timothy, there were some people who were spreading like false teachings in this church that Timothy's a pastor in. And he says that they have departed from the truth. They say that the resurrection has already taken place and that they destroy the faith of some. Nevertheless, God's solid foundation stands firm. sealed with this inscription, the Lord knows who are his. And so with that, Paul is saying, like, these people are falsely proclaiming that, like, Jesus won't, like, bring us to heaven with him. And then Paul is saying the Lord knows who are his. So we're resurrection people because the Lord knows us, and we will be raised again with Christ. So that means that Jesus is coming again, and we have to hope in that, because without that hope, then our faith is almost useless, because that's the whole goal, is that we'll be raised again with Christ.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Sydney. Yeah.
Wow, that's an awesome passage. I'm going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, starting verse 7. It says, "But we have this treasure is talking about the gospel, in jars of clay, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then death is at work in us, but life is at work in you." Why are we resurrection people? Because we're supposed to show the work of Jesus Christ in our everyday life. We're going to suffer. We're going to have difficult times where we are just beaten down, pressed, and given all kinds of awful situations, okay? That's the same as us as it is for the rest of the world. The difference is we're supposed to show the work of Jesus Christ, resurrecting us and making us new. We're supposed to be, I wouldn't say glad, we're supposed to expect that difficult circumstance because we know that Jesus is working in us to show that resurrection power that he has and to show the rest of the world as we respond to that as Christians what he is all about. So we are supposed to rise from the ashes of sometimes what we're given in life in order to show what Jesus is all about. That's part of us living out the gospel. That's my answer.
That's good. I really appreciate what you guys have had to say. And it's funny, Ryan, you said 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and I was like, oh man, that's exciting because the passage that I chose to read and to finish our night out is 2 Corinthians chapter 5. The passage is 11 through 6:2. I'm not going to read it all, but this is what Paul is saying here. So right after he talks about being like the work of Christ in our life, this is basically what is to show out of the work of Christ in our life. Because when we think back on the resurrection of Christ, we can have joy in that. And then like Sydney was saying, the hope is for the second coming of Christ and the return of Christ. But in the middle, in between those times, how are we to live? And this is what he says here. Starting in verse 14. "For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all," talking about Jesus, "and therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. So now, from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone, and the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation." And this is what that means. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and he has now committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. And so when I think about us being resurrection people, I think this passage sums up the work of Christ in our life, and as a result of Christ's work, how are we now to live? Paul says we are ambassadors for Christ. We are to carry the message of reconciliation because of the ministry of reconciliation. The work of God in our life should cause us to share the work of Christ in our life with other people. And so I really enjoy these stories. I really enjoy getting to hear from you guys, your heart, some of the things that you enjoy from Scripture. But tonight, you hear in just a little bit, you guys are going to have the chance to go into your small groups. And so we want you guys to enjoy getting to see each other, see one another, but to also maybe just share a few of your stories, some of your favorite stories from the ashes stories or the stories of resurrection that you find joy in. So that's all for tonight. But guys, hey, tune in over the next couple of weeks for the new curriculum we have coming up. And if your group's meeting for Zoom here in a very little bit, go ahead and jump onto that. If you need information on what your group Zoom password is, DM us on Instagram, and we'd be happy to get that information to you guys. Other than that, happy Easter, and thanks for joining us.